Hi everyone, welcome to DMICE Informatics Conference. Thank you for being here on a special day, a Monday instead of Thursday, also a special place rather than our normal in the basement of the BIC. Today we have an intern presentation by Harsha Uppili, and also myself. I will be talking about the wider picture of what Harsha has been working on this summer. We have had interns here in DMICE for several summers, and this is the last one on this particular grant, but on the training grant. But Harsha has been working with me over the summer. Harsha comes, he has spent some time at Georgia Tech and is currently at Swarthmore College, but will also spend a little bit of time at MIT, so he's getting around in his undergraduate experience. But he's no stranger to the Portland area. He was raised here, and so it's been a good time working with Harsha over the summer. And I'm going to invite him up to present on towards automating clinical text processing for EHR search resources. So let's welcome Harsha.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it. As Stephen said, my name's Harsha, and today I'll be presenting my work towards automating clinical text processing for EHR search resources. So I'll begin by giving motivation background for our research, talking about information retrieval as a whole. Then we'll proceed into the work I did. I've kind of divvied that up into two parts, one about NLP text processing, other statistical analysis. So we'll go through those, and then I'll conclude by talking about my takeaways and conclusions from the research. So our research as a whole is within the sphere of information retrieval. Information retrieval, or IR, boils down to the idea of retrieving relevant information among a large collection based on a user's need. So the most obvious example might be like a web search, Google, with searching within your email for certain emails, searching within your laptop. These are all examples of information retrieval and how we use it on a daily basis. So it boils down to, given a user's task, the user will need to extract certain information from a collection. So you will run a search against that collection and try and get that information. Today, users not only expect that we are able to retrieve the information, but also get that information ranked in terms of relevance, ranked to IR. So matching the relevance as to how closely the information matches the search query. So a main cornerstone of information retrieval is being able to evaluate the effectiveness of search. So this is a truly critical question. How efficient and accurate can we make an IR system? Ideally, an IR system should be able to retrieve as many relevant documents as possible and as few non-relevant documents as possible. These can be contradictory tasks, so we need to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of our search. Oh, sorry about that. That's jumped ahead. So one way of evaluating the effectiveness of search is taking what we call the Cranfield approach. And the Cranfield approach suggests the idea that first we choose the ways in which we want to retrieve information. We use those methods and generate ranked lists, and then we evaluate those ranked lists for effectiveness. And so that's the approach that we undertook in this research, and I'll talk a little bit more about. Lastly, I'd like to touch upon the idea of natural language processing and how that can help us within information retrieval. So we have our large data set or text that we want to search against. Often, if we use natural language processing and process that text and annotate it with tokens or parts of speech tags, that can help us, because we're breaking down the text, run that search. So such is the benefit of using natural language processing in an IR system. So the combination of electronic health records and information retrieval really maximizes utility of both. Electronic health records represent an enormous opportunity for information retrieval because of the enormity of the collections. In our collection, we have over 100,000 documents. But that also represents a challenge. How effectively, how efficiently can we extract information from that massive collection? Is there any way we can limit the amount of data we're looking at? Just look at a subset of that data. How do we search it quickly and efficiently? So these are the questions that we will delve a little bit deeper into in this talk. So now I'll proceed to the first part of the research, which looked at natural language processing, large-scale processing of clinical text. And our goal here is to be able to do large-scale NLP processing for search purposes, again, making it easier to break down the text and do our search. So the software that I use to do this is CTAKE's Clinical Pipeline. And it's developed by the Mayo Clinic, and it's especially useful for retrieving information from medical texts. So CTAKE's has three main components. It has a collection reader, an analysis engine, and a CAS consumer, CAS being an object. And the way it works is we start with our data, and we run a collection reader against that data. The collection reader interfaces to the data, and it returns a CAS object. And that object contains both the documents we're looking at as well as additional metadata, so things we're trying to tag or extract from the documents. And then we run that CAS object through an analysis engine, which returns an enriched CAS object. And finally, we use the CAS consumer aspect to output the application-specific data structure that we need in order to read the processed text. So in our case, that was XMI output. So what I would do is I'd work with the collection processing engine from UEMA Apache's class. I would develop different collection readers to interface to the types of text and data that we were working with. And then we'd run with an analysis engine with it, and then we'd select a CAS consumer to write our output to an XMI document. So this would contain the annotated text and the information, and then we would analyze those XMI and see our output. So that was the first part. That's an overview of the NLP pipeline and the large-scale text processing that we did. I'll now move on to the statistical analysis of EHR search results portion of my research. So the problem setting here is that we have our large database of patients. We were able, and we have information on those patients. We were able to process all our text using NLP. And so now we want to run a search against that database. In this case, we had 56 different topics that we searched against our data. And for each of the 56 searches, 56 topics, we ran 48 different searches. One from each of the parameter groups below. The first one representing, for example, the retrieval model. And so below I have two examples of different searches we ran. So we generate an enormous amount of ranked lists because each of the 48 searches for 56 topics generates a ranked list. And so then what we want to do is we want to be able to do relevance judgments on those ranked lists to get the relevant information. But it is truly unfeasible to do those because of the enormous amount of ranked lists that we're generating. It is really unfeasible to do that. So the question we asked is, are there combinations of parameters for the search that are redundant, or are there those that combined offer an optimal diversity and relevance of patients that we can use for analysis? So for example, if we have two ranked lists, these are randomly generated patient IDs, how can we quantify the similarities and differences? So like if two lists are very identical, then we don't want to have to run relevance judgments on both of those lists. That's inefficient. So is there a lot of overlap? Is there a lot of difference? And how do we quantify that? So we used a MAP score, mean average precision, to approximate similarity. Essentially, for any given list, among our 48, we would go through, compare each list individually against the other lists, and take the average of the similarity scores. So this metric allows us to measure diversity, which is important. We want a diverse pool of patients to do relevance judgments on. But we still need to consider the relevance. Keep in mind these lists are ranked. And I showed you two sample ranked lists, but in reality, those ranked lists contain 1,000 patients. And we cut that off at 1,000. And we want to be able to take into account relevance, the ranking of each individual patient. So the concept we use to deal with relevance is this idea of pseudo-relevance feedback, where you would consider only the top N patients in a given list to be relevant. So we consider the top N equals 10 patients, and then 100 and 200, and 1,000 patients in each list to be relevant, therefore taking into account the ranking portion of constructing a diverse and relevant pool. The other idea that we utilize is this idea of symmetry. When we did the score calculations, we did them both as symmetric scores and asymmetric scores. Symmetric scores meaning for a given pair AB of lists, we would consider AB and BA to be like lists. So we would take the average of those two scores. And then when we did asymmetric score calculation, we would consider AB to be a distinct pair from BA. So I used Seaborn, a Python package, matplotlib, and we decided upon graphical analysis for doing our relevance, or for seeing our similarities. So this is a sample heat map at pseudo-relevance level of n equals 200, meaning we considered only the top 200 patients in our ranked lists to be relevant. And so we can see that the retrieval model, which is the 4-parameter group, corresponds to 4x4 blocks very well. So from that, since we can break them down into 4x4 cohesive blocks, we can take away that very little diversity is introduced with the 4-parameter group. And if we zoom out, then we can see that for the 8x8 blocks along the diagonal, we get good, aside from the diagonal, we get good diversity. So this is a sample n equals 200 pseudo-relevance. Oh, sorry. And say we look at the n equals 1,000 pseudo-relevance plot. The same trends don't necessarily hold true. This shows us that the way we determine relevance, the pseudo-relevance levels, do have an effect on how our pool of diverse and optimal patients are extracted. So now if we go back to the n equals 200 pseudo-relevance, we can look at the 16 by 16 blocks. So we're looking at 16 by 16 pairs, and we see that, for example, the top left and the bottom right are not easily distinguished from each other, except along the main diagonal. So we know that there's relatively little diversity introduced by subsetting that data. And we can make additional conclusions like these. So here, if we look at a pseudo-relevance level of n equals 200 and look at both the asymmetric and symmetric score calculations, the same patterns that we observe for 4 by 4 blocks, 8 by 8 blocks are maintained for these results. And we can also observe that there isn't a significant difference between the asymmetric and symmetric results. So we can conclude that how we calculate the score does not have a humongous effect on generating a diverse and relevant pool. So we can make some conclusions such as, following which strategies would allow for an optimal pool, which parameters are in fact redundant and are unnecessary when we're doing our relevance judgments, how we can create a set of 12 runs that would provide us with good relevance. So we were able to here achieve our goal of being able to see how we can generate from our 48 times 56 number of ranked lists, a number of lists that would provide us with the optimal pool of patients to do judgments on. And so now I'll go over the overview of the entire project, kind of tying together how everything meets and provides for an optimal IR system. So in the yellow, we start with all our structured data. We try and break down that data using natural language processing, add metadata. This only makes it easier to do our searching on. And so then what we do is we run Elasticsearch. This is our searching mechanism. And we run 56 different topics in our scenario against the Elasticsearch. And we get different ranked lists for that. And so ultimately what we want to be able to do is do relevant judgments, but because we have such an enormous amount of ranked lists and it is unfeasible to go through all of them, we have to utilize some sort of sampling algorithm, some sort of sampling method to reduce the number of ranked lists that we need to look at. So for that, what we did is, of course, the graphical analysis. And so then if we utilize that sampling algorithm, reduce the number of patients we have to look at while still maintaining optimal diversity and relevance, we can then do relevance judgments and successfully extract enough information for IR. So to conclude, the first part of my work was using CTAKE software, CTAKE's clinical pipeline, to do natural language processing. I worked on developing collection readers to interface to different types of data with the goal that we can do large-scale text processing. And then we can run that through Elasticsearch and break down and annotate the text, do searching more effectively. And then I also did some statistical analysis to work on a sampling method so we could reduce the number of patients and ranked lists that we have to look at in order to do relevance judgments. And so future work, which will start as soon as this presentation and Stevens is over, is looking at time benchmarking for CTAKEs large scale on, say, Exacloud or additional resources, and doing parallel processing for running CTAKEs. So I've grown enormously over the summer. Obviously, one of the things I most enjoyed is seeing my week-to-week progression. I've only picked up computer science in the last year, and it's a light and day difference doing schoolwork versus something in a more professional setting. And working with Steven and understanding, how software engineering works, starting with a very small goal, testing that very vigorously, understanding that things are going to change along the way and you have to be adaptable, be innovative, try different methodologies. So it's been a very invaluable experience from a technical perspective, as well as a statistical perspective. You know, working with Stephen and others to understand how the merger of statistics and computer science can produce really innovative output, and how to try and tie these two subjects together has been something that will stick with me for quite a long time. So I'd like to thank three people very much in particular. First one I'll start with is Tamara, who was kind enough to come today. Tamara has been a great friend for me, been very open about me reaching out, and she's been a great resource, especially for this presentation and for the research in general. Tamara's always willing to help me tie together how the technical aspects tie into the bigger picture, and looking at it from a non-CS perspective, and understanding how the research really applies in the field of biomedical informatics. And I really appreciate Tamara's kindness and her willingness to offer me any help I need, or especially her time, and always chat it up. I really appreciate that. Ariel, who's not here, Ariel is he's such a quick thinker, and he has really showed me how to approach computer science. He's pushed me, taught me to be innovative. He's always encouraging me to learn more about Bash or Python, pushing me to try out different sub-projects as I work on this. And I really appreciate that, and his willingness to share resources with me, and push me to become a stronger computer scientist, and from the technical perspective. And last but not least, Stephen, who's, I first want to thank Stephen for providing me with a very unique opportunity to work with him this summer. Stephen is always accessible. He's always willing to talk to you. Always willing to, he exhibits endless patience, especially with me. And he's never not willing to go through something on the whiteboard and ensure that you get it. He's good at both pushing you and making sure you don't stray off course, and continue making progress. I've gleaned a lot from watching you do your research, and how you approach your research, how you approach being a scientist, and how to be a professional. And I really appreciate you taking your time to mentor me this summer. I really do. So thank you all for coming, and if you have any questions, let me know. Yeah.
Yeah. So without parallelizing anything, how long did it take to run on the that you had?
That's a good question. It depends on both the types of documents we were running, as well as which analysis engines and CAS consumers that we chose. I would say for the data set that we intend to do parallel processing with, it took probably 25 minutes to do. So that's still a very long time, and so we're hoping that working with Condor, or software HT Condor, and working with Exacloud can really speed up that process. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
All right, thanks again. Whoa. Thanks again for being here, and thanks, Harsha, for your presentation. I'm just going to give a little bit more context on the background of sort of EHR search and the grant research that Harsha has been a part of. And before I do that, I just want to kind of recognize one of those diagrams was actually created by someone in the room, Amy Yates. It said source Stephen Wu. It wasn't me that drew the diagram, so just wanted to let you know that. Anyways, so today I'm talking about developing resources for patient-level information retrieval. And basically what we're talking about, as Harsha was talking about, is search in electronic health records, right? So why would you want to do search in electronic health records, or why would you want to study it? If you're a clinician, maybe you want to do individual patient search. Dr. Yuri Sklenar from the Cardiovascular Institute a few months ago put up this quote from a KCVI faculty. There was a survey question, describe what you'd like the informatics to look like in KCVI within 3 to 5 years. And it's kind of unbounded, whatever you could dream of from informatics. And the answer was, be able to identify clinic patients you vaguely remember something about based on limited data like a medication they were on, diagnosis, time frame that you saw them, like a Google search. This is actually not possible in Epic right now. It's not possible in many, many, many of the EHR systems that are deployed around the US and in other places right now. And you'd think maybe people would have tackled this before, but we'll get to some of the challenges in a little bit. Now, you might not be a physician, but you might still be interested in looking for patients in electronic health records because you could be a researcher trying to look for cohorts of patients. So patient cohort search, you could be looking for a profile like this one, adults under age 65 with rheumatoid arthritis who have cyclic citrulline peptide antibodies greater than 40. I don't know what that means. But in this kind of query, you are doing sort of a metadata filter on the age. You're also looking at this diagnosis and saying, well, are there symptoms? Where am I going to find this thing? Is it a code or is it in text? Are there synonyms of that? Also you're looking at, I think, a lab name and value. I could be wrong. Maybe it's not. It is. Okay, Tamara says it is, and she's a medical expert. Looking for something like this is a known task. The Trek Medical Records track in 2011-2012 did actually try to do this look for this kind of thing. So what you're trying to do is you have evidence in medical records. So for each patient or for a visit or something like that, you have multiple documents. And within those documents, you're looking for pieces of information that are relevant to your cohort of interest, and then you have to decide for that patient or for that encounter or something like that, are they in that cohort or out, right? It's just a binary decision of whether they're in or out. Now, like I said, this is actually a challenging setting. Why? Because one, there's a lot of data diversity, and you have to do patient-level aggregation. I mean, you've got metadata like demographics as well as clinical notes, and it's not immediately clear how you harmonize those sources of information. But you need to do it in order to make a patient-level decision about whether they're in or out. Additionally, from a linguistics perspective, we would say that there's a constrained pragmatics, right? There's a doctor and a patient. They talk to each other about something that happened in the past, and then they're doing something in the present. And from that, you get clinical notes that are written. So it's a constrained setting that they're writing it in. One other thing that comes out of that constrained setting is that there's missing data, right? It's not like you're constantly monitoring the patient. You just evaluate them at a particular point in time, and you talk about what's happened at that one point in time. Perhaps most importantly for how this is challenging for us is that you can't share the data because, unless it's de-identified, because of patient confidentiality concerns, right? So Google can access all of the public websites in the world. They crawl it, all that kind of stuff. You cannot crawl EHRs. So another reason this is challenging is because anytime somebody wants to evaluate something in search, they're really asking, does this work on my problem at my institution? And what we found is that each problem, each institution actually has different characteristics, and performance is very difficult to characterize across all of these different settings. So So patient-level IR is challenging. One of the things that we're trying to do to address this is to build intra-institutional Cranfield collections. So Harsha mentioned Cranfield collections, and basically they have three components: documents, topics. Documents is what you're looking in, topics is what you're looking for, and relevance judgments is, like Harsha said, how you know you're doing a good job or a bad job at finding the things that you're interested in, right? So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is give 9 principles for clinical IR, and in fact for clinical IR resources, or collections, or corpora, however you want to say it. 9 principles, and we'll go through those 3 aspects of Cranfield collections. Okay? So we'll start with collections. The first thing about IR collections in the clinical domain is that we advocate that they should stay intra-institutional. Okay? So patient confidentiality is something that's kind of constrained within an institution. We're never going to have data freely available everywhere because of HIPAA, because of IRBs, because of patient confidentiality concerns that are, rightly, those barriers are rightly there in place. So instead of worrying about patient confidentiality and trying to get this to researchers everywhere so they can improve their IR systems and stuff like that, we're going to worry about that sharing step later and go ahead and start building collections within an institution now. And what this means is that you don't have to de-identify your data in order to share it with somebody else, right? And you don't have to, before you start building your collection, before you start doing your IR research, okay, we got to de-identify the data, and then we can share it, and then we can do all this stuff on it. No, we just start on it now and then worry about the de-identification later, and I'll talk about future work of stuff like evaluation as a service, where hopefully we'll be able to do do some things that are like sharing, or at least allowing other researchers to take part. So this project, in terms of staying intra-institutional, we have 2 sites, OHSU and Mayo Clinic, and we have intra-institutional data within each of those sites. We share things like topics, or the cohort queries, the cohorts that you're interested in finding. We share systems for finding patients, and we share results on an aggregate statistical level. But each individual site has its own data, so you use your own patients, your own medical records, and their own relevance judgments. So they make their own assessment for, did this system get what we wanted from our data set? So one thing to point out here for OHSU data is that this is actually a repository IRB. So if anybody is interested in actually using our data set, which you'll hear a little bit more about as this talk goes on, you can actually write our data set into your IRB and be able to see it and use the interface for chart review that we've developed. So we have it intra-institutionally, and it's actually a resource, a repository for others here at OHSU to be able to use. But you do need to, if you're asking a new research question with the data, then you need to write it into your own IRB. Okay, the second principle for collections is that collections are patient populations, right? So think about that. If you've got a collection of patients and their data, then whoever's in that pool is your population of people. And if you are doing a query for a disease in that population, you're basically doing a poor man's disease prevalence, right? You're looking, is this person in or out? And you're basically looking for prevalence of that particular cohort definition, or if that cohort definition is a disease, then that's what you're finding. And so you have all of your patients as your population, and then a subset of them maybe have rheumatoid arthritis and fit the criteria, right? Now, What's also interesting about this kind of setting is that when we start looking at multi-site, you have a site 2, that's Mayo Clinic for us, and you subset, which of these patients have rheumatoid arthritis? Well, then basically you can do a poor man's comparative epidemiology. You can look at the 2 sites and see how their prevalence differs. Okay, so our data here at OHSU, our patient population is primary care patients from 2009 to 2013, and we have all of their EPIC records. All is a funny word, but pretty comprehensive, both text data and relevant structured data pieces from the electronic health record. Okay? So the third point here, the third principle is that we want to capture and represent many data types. Okay? So we do have text data. That's kind of what the typical search algorithms are using, but we also have structured data in the electronic health records, like I said, metadata and labs and stuff like that. And you can use that to do things like filtering, just like you would do in any database. But here we'd like to harmonize that with a sort of text search system as well. Another thing that you could use structured data for is discourse context for text, so that maybe some of the demographics tell you something about what to expect in the text or what something means in the text because you know what kind of patient you're dealing with, something like that. So you can see here in our data we have this demographics field shows that we have about 100,000 patients in our data set, and that's one kind of structured data. And this notes field is the main field where you have clinical text, and we have about 10 million notes there, and so we have about 100 notes per patient on average in the data set here at OHSU. So there's a lot of data types. It ranges from around 32 million current medications down to about 32,000 surgeries overall. So it can range depending on what kind of data type, how many are there in the system, or there in the database. Okay, so we've looked at the collection. The next thing for Cranfield collections is topics. In other words, what are you going to be looking for from your collection? And so principle number 4 is to get topics from diverse and practical sources. So you could be looking for, so there's a difference between primary and secondary uses of EHR data. Primary is kind of like that first setting where a doctor might be interested in using search for clinical care, right? They're using the EHR for clinical care, whereas a secondary use of electronic health record is, it's already been collected for care. How can we look back on that or look at that and use it for some other purpose other than what it was, than patient care itself? So we're mostly focusing on the latter, on the secondary use of EHR data. But partly what this means is that we don't have query logs or active systems. We don't actually have search implemented somewhere. So Google will go and whatever you enter into that box, it owns, and it knows what everybody else has been searching in that box. And what you've been searching in that box. We don't have a box like that right now, so we don't have a query log where we can see, oh, this is what people are interested in and how they phrase it in XYZ, right? So we don't have active systems to learn from. So we developed a limited set of secondary use topics that we could use as a regression set that we could test many systems against. But we tried to make it diverse from practical sources. So we have some that are public health or clinical investigations, some of these topics. So we have requests to OHSU at Oak Tree. And we also have some from Mayo Clinic and the Rochester Epidemiology Project, which is a public health project at Mayo Clinic. So with these sets, we have sort of public health, clinical investigation kind of use cases. So that's one kind of practical use. But we also have some informatics research use cases like phenotype knowledge base had some cohorts defined, and so we adopted some of those. We also adopted some from the National Quality Forum, which is like an operations improvement, also some good informatics research from that kind of thing. So these are all practical questions you might ask, practical cohorts you might be looking for in electronic health records, but for various reasons. So diverse and practical. Okay, so that's number 4. Number 5, kind of arising from that, we have, because we have both specific and vague sources, a diversity of sources, we need to actually use multiple representations of each topic in order to capture capture and normalize the different kinds of stipulated topics that are there. So you can see a really short summary statement A here on the left. B there is a brief summary and mock clinical case, and C kind of a summary plus some structured data, right? So there's inclusion and exclusion stuff there. So that's for the topics, basically the theme of diversity. Finally, for the relevance judgments, what does it take to get stuff, human judgments that are going to tell us whether our systems, search systems, are doing well or not? Our relevance judgments, our first observation is that we need to use medical experts as relevance judges. And this is basically providing a human rating of topic-patient relevance. So is this is this patient that I'm looking at and reviewing their chart for relevant to the cohort that I'm interested in? And we can't do crowdsourcing on this. One, because of patient confidentiality. You can't just get anyone on Mechanical Turk to look at somebody's identified health records. Another reason is because of medical expertise. You have a topic like this one, adults with post-herpetic neuralgia using Q-Tenza, something like that. I don't know what that is. A Turker probably doesn't know what that is. And so you need some medical expertise in order to do some of this judging. So we have expert annotators both here, Tamara Timmons, who's in the room, and at Mayo Clinic, Donna Urke. So number 7 of 9, treat relevance assessment as chart review. And this basically falls out from the previous one. Chart review is a known quantity in the medical domain, and it's reasonably more complicated than doing web pages, right? If you're judging whether a web page is relevant to a query, you look at one web page and you say, okay, that's relevant or not. If you're doing visits or encounters in our data set, like each time a patient comes in for a hospital stay, 5.9 documents per judgment. If you're looking at a whole patient and all of their information, over 100 documents per judgment, right? So this is pretty complicated of a setting. Fortunately, the time it takes to judge this many documents doesn't scale with the number of documents, but it's still a more complicated task. And it's compounded by the fact that you have complicated criteria, right? So we have topics like this one, and within this topic, there's under age 65, rheumatoid arthritis, positive cyclic citrulline peptide antibodies, not on a genetic opt-out list, and an encounter date within the last 2 years. That's 5 things that somebody who's reviewing a chart has to keep in mind in order to say whether they're in or out of this particular topic, right? And so basically it's a difficult task. There's a cognitive load that's hard for people to keep in mind. So, hey, maybe we need to find ways to make intermediate judgments or sub-judgments about things. So we designed the Patient Relevant Assessment Interface, PRAI, also worked on by people in this room. This is what it looks like, and this is also our 8th principle, basically simplify the task with a good UI, and the effort it takes to put in put in to design this, we think helps the more repeated process of lots of judgments. And so what you see here is the ability for each line, for each patient is a line, for each patient to say whether they fit or don't fit into that cohort. You see on this screen the possibility to say on this document or this piece of metadata or this piece of this lab test or something, you can say yes or no, and that supports or doesn't support them being into the cohort. So basically we have the ability to do this exact kind of subjudgments, intermediate things that were mentioned before. Okay. So how do we actually figure out what patients to show in this framework? This is kind of where what Harsha worked on in the second part of his talk came in. How do we generate the pools to show in PRAI? We had 100,000 patients. We generated baseline runs and did sampling, just like Harsha mentioned. We actually ran this with a sampling where we put out 45 possible patients from out of their lists, and then did a set union of sampled patients for each of those 48 runs. So combine that, and those are the patients to be judged. Harsha is basically helping us figure out, are there ways to improve sampling methods? Are there ways to say which of these, to kind of actively learn and figure out which of these patients and which of these runs that generated the patient list should be used? Okay, number 9 is kind of the last one. We have already this process with collections, topics, and judgments. Go back through all of it and kind of measure the feasibility of your project, so of your process. So Tamara took 5 topics and looked at, how well is the interface performing, how well are the runs produced relevant, and how long does it take to assess these things. And what you see with the assessment time here on the right is that there's kind of a variability in assessment time. You've got 4.2 minutes per patient on the last topic, whereas there's only 1 minute per patient on the third topic. So there's a variability in how long it takes to say whether a patient fits into your cohort or not. So with this kind of like preliminary judgment, what that enables you to do is iterate if necessary. And you can improve your process. And one of the things that we did from this is we actually introduced the topic representation C with more structured topics because of this kind of measuring the feasibility of the process. Okay, so basically what I've talked about today is our collections that are intra-institutional. They represent patient populations, and they link multiple data types. Okay, all right. We have IR topics that are from a diversity of sources and are represented in a diversity of ways. And then we have IR relevance judgments that are basically considered chart reviews by medical experts. And we do them with this PRAI interface. So our future work is going to be on multi-site evaluation as a service, basically creating this huge collection where only OHSU researchers can use it. It seems like it might be wasted effort, but it's definitely not wasted if we figure out evaluation as a service, where instead of sending data to people, to algorithms, so that they can evaluate themselves and send us their results, we'll have them send their algorithms to us, and then run those results within our firewall and all that kind of stuff, and figure out their results and send them back to them. So it's a different paradigm, and that's kind of where we're going next with this. So thank you. So I'd like to open up to questions, either to me or Harsha, if you'd like to, if you have a late breaking question for Harsha as well. question. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, how do you envision people sending their algorithms to you? Because is that paper, a program, a plugin?
Yeah, the question was, how do we envision having the algorithms sent to us? And I'll give a simple one-word answer for now. Docker. Anybody else? Other questions? I can elaborate on that if you want, but we're still writing the grant, so. Other questions? All right, looks like we're done early. Thank you all for coming to DMICE Informatics Conference.